I want to be honest with you. I'm currently not earning anything from these stories, but I'm still putting my time, effort, and heart into creating them for you. If you enjoy my content and want to support me, joining my Patreon would honestly help me a lot and give me the motivation to keep creating even better stories. Even one membership can make a real difference to me. Thank you for being here and supporting my work. The last thing I remember before everything changed was the smell of coffee on my coat. Cheap coffee, the kind you get from a vending machine at 11:30 at night when your shift runs 2 hours over and you're just trying to stay awake long enough to get home. I'd been on my feet for 14 hours, double shift at the restaurant because Maria called in sick again, and I was the only one dumb enough to answer when the manager called. My name is Alina Ferrero. I was 24 years old, and I had exactly 47 euros in my bank account. That's the kind of detail you remember when your life splits into before and after. The platform at Milano Central was nearly empty. Just a few late-night travelers, a couple of teenagers with headphones, and an old man sleeping on a bench with a newspaper over his face. The train to Geneva Brignole was already waiting, its windows glowing a dull yellow against the dark. I checked the schedule board one more time. 23:47, right on time. I stepped through the doors and immediately realized the train was more crowded than I expected for this hour. Every seat in the first carriage seemed taken. I walked through the connecting door into the second carriage. Same thing. People sat quietly, most of them looking at their phones or staring out the windows at nothing. There was a strange stillness I didn't understand yet. The third carriage. I walked down the aisles, scanning left and right. Taken, taken, taken. A woman with a sleeping child. Two men in dark coats sitting across from each other, not talking. An elderly couple sharing a blanket. And then, near the back of the carriage, I saw it, the only empty seat on the entire train. It was next to a man sitting by the window. It was maybe 40, 45. Dark hair cut short, streaked with early gray at the temples. He wore a black overcoat over what looked like an expensive charcoal suit. His hands rested on his thighs, and even from a distance, I could see the heaviness in his posture, like a man carrying something that had nothing to do with luggage. His jaw was set, his eyes fixed on the dark glass of the window, watching the platform lights reflect against nothing. I didn't think twice. My feet were killing me, and there was nowhere else to sit. "Excuse me," I said, "is this seat taken?" He turned his head slowly. His eyes were dark brown, almost black, and they studied me with a kind of careful attention that felt unusual. Not aggressive. Not interested in the way men on late trains sometimes are. More like he was trying to figure out something about me that I didn't know myself. "No," he said quietly, "it's free." I dropped into the seat, set my bag on my lap, and let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The cushion was thin, but after 14 hours of standing, it felt like heaven. "Long day?" he asked. His voice was low, measured, the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud. "You have no idea," I said without looking at him. I was already closing my eyes, tilting my head back. The train shuddered and began to move. The platform slid away, replaced by the darkness of the rail corridor heading south. I could feel the vibration through the seat, the rhythmic clacking of the wheels, and for a moment I thought I might actually fall asleep. That's when I noticed the quiet. It happened gradually, like water cooling. The soft conversations in the carriage died one by one. A man across the aisle who had been talking on his phone lowered his voice and then hung up entirely. The woman with the sleeping child pulled the child closer and looked straight ahead, her face blank. The two men in dark coats hadn't moved at all. I realized now that they hadn't spoken to each other even once since I'd boarded. I opened my eyes and glanced around. Nobody was looking at me. Nobody was looking at each other. But something had changed. The air felt different, heavier, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the birds stop singing and you can taste metal in the back of your throat. I looked at the man beside me. He was still staring out the window, but his jaw had tightened. His right hand had shifted, just slightly, toward the inside of his coat. "Are you all right?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately. His eyes moved from the window to the reflection in the glass, scanning the carriage behind us without turning his head. "You should move," he said softly, almost gently, "if there's another seat." "There isn't," I checked. Something flickered in his expression, not annoyance, something closer to regret. The lights in the carriage flickered once, twice, then steadied. A cold draft moved through the aisle, and I heard the connecting door at the far end of the carriage open and close. Two men walked in. They wore leather jackets and moved with a deliberate slowness that didn't match the rhythm of late-night travelers. They weren't looking for seats. They were looking at faces. And every passenger in the carriage seemed to already know it. The two men moved down the aisle like they owned the train. One was tall, broad-shouldered, with a shaved head and a scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. The other was shorter, thinner, with sharp features and restless eyes that jumped from face to face like a predator scanning a herd. Nobody looked at them. That's what struck me most. Not one person raised their eyes. The woman with the child pressed her face into the child's hair. The elderly couple sat perfectly still, the man's hand gripping his wife's fingers. Even the teenagers I'd seen earlier had gone silent, their headphones hanging around their necks. "What's happening?" I whispered. The man beside me didn't move, didn't flinch, but his voice came low and steady, barely above the sound of the wheels. "Don't look at them. Look at your phone. Pretend you're reading something." Something in his tone made me obey without question. I pulled my phone from my bag and opened it, my fingers trembling just slightly. The screen glowed in my face, and I stared at a message from my mother I'd read 3 hours ago without seeing a single word. The two men stopped about 4 rows ahead of us. The tall one leaned down and said something to a man sitting alone. The man shook his head quickly, almost frantically. The tall one straightened and kept walking. They were getting closer. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. The man beside me hadn't moved, but I could sense a coiled tension in him, like a spring compressed to its limit. His breathing was controlled, deliberate, and I realized with a jolt that this wasn't fear. This was preparation. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He turned to look at me then, really look at me, not just a glance. In that moment, I saw something in his eyes I didn't expect. Concern, not for himself, for me. "Someone who made a mistake getting on this train," he said, "and you made a mistake sitting next to me." The shorter man was now 3 rows away. His eyes swept over the passengers like searchlights. When they landed on me, they paused for just a fraction of a second before moving on and then snapping back. Not to me, to the man beside me. I saw recognition flash across the shorter man's face. His hand moved toward the inside of his jacket. "Senor," the shorter man said, stopping in the aisle beside our row. His voice was polite, almost pleasant, but his eyes were ice. "We've been looking for you." The man beside me exhaled slowly. "I know." "Senor Valent would like a word." "Valent can wait." The shorter man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "He's been waiting for 6 months. He's not a patient man, as you know." I sat frozen, my phone still glowing uselessly in my hand. The tall man with the scar had positioned himself 2 rows behind us, blocking the aisle. We were boxed in. "There's a woman sitting next to me," the man said calmly. "She has nothing to do with this." The shorter man glanced at me with the casual indifference of someone assessing furniture. "Then she should be grateful we're not here for her. She should be left alone, completely." Something in the way he said it, the weight, the quiet authority made the shorter man hesitate, just for a beat. Then he nodded once. "Of course, we're civilized men." He looked back at my seatmate. "But you'll come with us to the front carriage. Senor Valent is waiting in the first-class compartment." The man beside me was silent for a long moment. The train rocked gently on the tracks. Outside the window, there was nothing but darkness and the occasional flash of a distant farmhouse light. Then he stood. As he rose from his seat, I noticed something that sent ice through my veins. The inside of his coat shifted, and I caught the unmistakable outline of a holster. He was armed. The man I'd been sitting next to, making small talk with, was carrying a gun on a late-night train. He looked down at me. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it. I could hear it in his voice, see it in the tightness around his mouth. "Wait," I said, not knowing why. "Who are you?" He held my gaze for a moment that seemed to stretch the boundaries of time. "My name is Luca Morty," he said, "and I need you to stay in this seat and not move, no matter what you hear." Then he walked away down the aisle, flanked by the 2 men, and the connecting door swung shut behind them. The carriage exhaled. I could feel it, the collective release of 40 people who had been holding their breath. The woman across the aisle looked at me with wide, disbelieving eyes. "Do you know who that was?" she whispered. "He said his name was Luca Morty." Her face went white. "Madonna Santa," she crossed herself. "That's Luca Morty. He runs the Morty family. Half of northern Italy answers to him." She pulled her child tighter. "And you sat next to him like it was nothing." The train plunged into a tunnel, and the windows went black. In the reflection, I could see my own face staring back at me, pale, confused, and beginning to understand that the empty seat beside the most dangerous man on this train had never been empty by accident. Everyone else had known better. The train emerged from the tunnel, and the darkness outside was replaced by a flat stretch of countryside under a moonless sky. I sat perfectly still, just as Luca Morty had told me to. The carriage was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now, the nervous quiet of people who knew something was happening in the front of the train, but were too afraid to acknowledge it. I should have been afraid too. I was, in a way, but there was something else underneath the fear, something I couldn't name yet, the way he'd looked at me before walking away. The way he'd said, "I'm sorry," not as an apology for inconvenience, but like he was genuinely distressed that his proximity had put me in danger. The woman across the aisle was clutching a rosary now, her lips moving in silent prayer. The two men in dark coats who'd been sitting near the front of our carriage had both moved, one toward the connecting door, where he stood with his back against the wall, arms crossed. The other had disappeared entirely. I realized, watching the man by the door, that he wasn't one of Valent's men. He was dressed differently, better. His coat was longer, his shoes polished. He stood with the same coiled stillness I'd sensed in Luca Morty, and his eyes were fixed on me. A bodyguard, Morty's bodyguard. He'd been in the carriage the entire time, probably watching Morty from a distance. Probably there were others too. I looked around with new eyes and counted two more men who seemed too alert, too composed for ordinary passengers. They were scattered through the carriage, positioned at intervals that suddenly looked deliberate. Morty hadn't been traveling alone. He'd had protection all around him, but the seat next to him, the one seat that would place someone directly beside him in the line of fire, had been kept empty. A buffer, a safety margin. And I had walked right into it. My phone buzzed, a text from my mother. "Are you on the train? Call me when you get home." I typed back with shaking fingers. On the train, everything fine. Everything was not fine. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The bodyguard by the door hadn't moved. The other passengers had retreated into their private silences, some pretending to sleep, others staring at nothing. I could hear muffled sounds from the front of the train, nothing distinct, but the rhythm of voices carrying through metal walls. Then the connecting door opened, and Luca Morty walked back in. He was alone. His face was unchanged, composed, unreadable. But there was a new tension in the way he moved, a tightness in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. He walked down the aisle, and every head that had been carefully averted turned slightly to track him. He stopped at our row and looked down at me. "You're still here," he said. "You told me not to move." Something that might have been a smile touched the corner of his mouth. Most people wouldn't have listened. He sat down beside me. The train swayed, and his shoulder brushed mine. He smelled faintly of smoke, though I hadn't seen him smoke. Maybe it was from wherever he'd been, whatever room or carriage he'd spent the last 15 minutes in. "What happened?" I asked. "A conversation." "That's all." He looked at me sideways. "That's all it needs to be, for now." I should have left it there. I should have turned away, put in my earphones, and pretended the last 20 minutes hadn't happened. But something in me, the same stubborn impulse that made me work double shifts and argue with my landlord and refuse to move back to my parents' house in the countryside, wouldn't let it go. "That man said someone named Valent has been looking for you for 6 months. Why?" Luca Morty was quiet for a long time. The wheels clacked beneath us. The bodyguard by the door shifted his weight but didn't look away. 6 months ago," Morty said slowly, "I made a decision that cost Enzo Valent a great deal of money, and a great deal of pride. In my world, pride is worth more than money." He paused. "He believes I betrayed an agreement between our families, an agreement that has stood for over 20 years. "Did you?" His jaw tightened. "I chose to protect someone Valent wanted dead, a man who owed him money, a man with a wife and 2 young daughters who would have grown up without a father." He turned to look at me, and in the dim light, his eyes were unguarded for the first time. "So yes, I broke the agreement. I'd do it again." The train began to slow. Not a station, we were between stops. The deceleration was subtle at first, then more pronounced. The lights flickered again, longer this time. When they came back on, Luca Morty was on his feet. "Something's wrong," he said. He looked toward the front of the train, then toward the rear. His bodyguard had pushed off the wall, his hand inside his coat. The other men I'd identified as Morty's were moving too, subtle shifts in position, hands reaching for things I couldn't see. The train stopped completely. The silence that followed was absolute. No engine hum, no wheel noise. Just the faint ticking of cooling metal and the breathing of 50 frightened passengers. Then, from somewhere ahead, a single gunshot cracked through the night. The sound split the silence like glass breaking. The woman across the aisle screamed, a short, choked cry she cut off by pressing both hands over her mouth. The sleeping child woke and began to whimper. Several passengers dropped to the floor instinctively, crouching between the seats. Morty didn't flinch. He was already moving. "Marco," he said sharply, and the bodyguard by the door was at his side in 3 strides. They exchanged words in rapid, low Italian, too fast for me to catch everything, but I heard Valent, rear carriage, and quanti sono. How many are there? "Stay low," Morty said to me without looking back. Then he and Marco moved toward the rear of the carriage. The other 2 men I'd identified earlier fell in behind them, materializing from their seats like shadows gaining substance. I should have stayed low. I should have done exactly what he said. Instead, I pressed myself against the window and looked out into the darkness. The train had stopped on a stretch of track bordered by open fields. No station, no buildings, no lights except the pale glow from the train's own windows casting rectangles of yellow onto the gravel embankment. And then I saw them, moving along the outside of the train, visible only when they passed through the light from the windows, dark figures, at least 6, maybe more, approaching from both directions. Some carried what looked like automatic weapons. They moved with military precision, communicating through hand signals. This wasn't a conversation anymore. This was an ambush. A second gunshot came from somewhere behind our carriage, followed by the sound of breaking glass. Passengers screamed. An older man near the front began praying aloud in a voice that cracked with terror. The emergency lights kicked on, bathing everything in a sickly red glow. The connecting door at the rear of the carriage burst open. Marco came back in, bleeding from a cut above his eye. He was half carrying a younger man I hadn't seen before, one of Morty's, judging by the way Marco handled him. The young man's arm hung at a wrong angle. "They've sealed both ends," Marco said to no one in particular, but I understood. Valent's men had taken control of the train. The engine had been stopped deliberately. The driver was probably being held at gunpoint. Morty appeared behind them. His coat was open now, and the gun was in his hand, a dark, compact pistol that looked like an extension of his arm. His face was carved from stone, but his eyes were moving constantly, calculating, measuring. "Passengers, stay down," he called out. His voice carried authority that transcended fear. People obeyed not because they trusted him, but because in that moment he was the only person in the carriage who seemed to know what to do. He walked back to where I was crouched by the window. He knelt beside my seat, bringing his face level with mine. In the red emergency light, the lines around his eyes looked deeper, older. "Alina," he said. I startled. I hadn't told him my name. He must have seen my reaction because he added, "Your name tag from the restaurant." I looked down. My work apron was stuffed in my bag, but the clip-on name tag was still attached to my coat lapel. Elena, Ristorante Bellavista. I'd forgotten to take it off. "Listen to me carefully," he said. "Valent's men are going carriage by carriage. They want me, but Valent is a man who believes in messages. He won't just take me, he'll make sure everyone on this train remembers what happens to people who are near me. Do you understand?" I understood. My stomach turned to ice. "I'm going to draw them toward the front of the train. When they move, I need you to go to the rear. There's an emergency exit in the last carriage. Marco will." "I'm not leaving," I said. He stared at me. "You don't know what you're saying." "I'm saying I'm not leaving. If I run and they see me, I'm the girl who was sitting next to you. I'm the girl they'll come looking for later because they'll think I know something. I'm safer near you than I am alone in a field in the dark." Something changed in his face. It was subtle, a softening around the mouth, a flicker of something in those dark eyes that might have been recognition. Like he was seeing someone else in me, someone from a long time ago. "You remind me of my sister," he said quietly. "She argued like that, refused to leave when it was smart to leave." "Where is she now?" The pause lasted a heartbeat too long. "She's gone." Before I could respond, the lights went out completely. True darkness swallowed the carriage. Passengers gasped. Someone sobbed. And in the blackness, I heard the connecting door at the front of the carriage open with a slow, deliberate creak. A voice I didn't recognize spoke from the darkness, calm, almost amused. "Luca Morty, my old friend. Enzo sends his warmest regards." And then, the voice added something that made every nerve in my body ignite. "We know about the girl sitting next to you. We've already sent her photograph to Signor Valent. He's very curious about who she is." The darkness lasted only seconds before someone activated a flashlight at the front of the carriage. The beam swept across terrified faces and found its target, Luca Morty, standing in the aisle, his gun lowered but not holstered, his body positioned between the voice and the seat where I was still crouching. The man at the front of the carriage stepped into the light. He was older than I expected, mid-50s, gray hair slicked back, wearing a tailored overcoat that seemed almost absurd in the circumstances. He had the calm bearing of a man who attended operas and signed contracts, not one who boarded trains with armed men. But his eyes told a different story. They were flat, emotionless, the color of wet cement. Domenico, Morty said. The name landed like a stone. Domenico Ferrara. I would learn his full name later. Valent's right hand. The man who did the things Valent didn't want to do himself. You've made this very complicated, Luca, Domenico said, walking slowly down the aisle. Behind him, 3 armed men fanned out, their weapons not raised but visible. Enzo offered you terms, generous terms, the territory in Liguria, the port contracts. Your people left untouched. All he wanted was Santoro. Santoro was an accountant with a gambling problem, Morty said. Not a soldier, not a threat. Santoro had information, ledgers, names. You know what those names would mean if they reached certain prosecutors. So Valent wanted to kill a man to protect his books. Valent wanted to protect his family. Surely you understand family, Luca. The word hung in the air between them. I saw Morty's hand tighten on the grip of his pistol. Something deep and painful moved across his face, there and gone, like lightning behind clouds. You don't get to talk to me about family, Morty said, and his voice dropped to something barely human in its coldness. Not after what happened to Chiara. Chiara, his sister, the one who argued like me, the one who was gone. Domenico's expression didn't change, but I saw something shift in his posture, a micro-adjustment, a pulling back. Even he, with all his calculated cruelty, knew he had touched something volatile. That was business, Domenico said carefully, and it was a long time ago. It was 3 years ago, and it wasn't business. It was punishment, because I refused to let Valent expand his operations through my territory, so he took the only person who, Morty stopped. His chest rose and fell. When he spoke again, his voice was controlled, but I could hear the fractures underneath. He took my sister, made it look like an accident, a car crash outside Portofino, and then he sent flowers to the funeral. The carriage was absolutely silent. Every passenger was hearing this, hearing the private wound of a man they feared, stripped open in the red-tinted darkness. I could feel the weight of it pressing against my chest like a physical thing. Enzo doesn't want a war, Domenico said. He wants resolution. Then tell him to meet me himself, not send his dog on a train full of civilians. Domenico's smile was thin and joyless. He anticipated you'd say that. He reached into his coat pocket, slowly, deliberately, and produced a phone. He held it up so Morty could see the screen. A video was playing. Low quality, slightly shaky. It showed a residential street, a house with a green door and flower boxes in the windows. 2 little girls played in the front garden while a woman watched from the doorstep. Santoro's family, Domenico said. Beautiful children. The wife just planted those petunias last week. Morty's entire body went rigid. This is what Enzo wants you to understand, Domenico continued, his voice soft, almost fatherly. You saved Santoro's life, a noble gesture, but Santoro disappeared 3 weeks ago. He ran, Luca, took those ledgers with him, and now Enzo believes you know where he went. I don't. Enzo doesn't believe you. Then Enzo is a fool. Domenico lowered the phone. Perhaps, but he's a fool with men outside that house right now, and men on this train, and a girl, he nodded toward me, who was photographed sitting next to you, who will be investigated, whose family will be questioned, whose entire life will become very uncomfortable. He paused. Unless you tell us where Santoro went. I felt the blood drain from my face. My mother, my brother in Parma, my tiny apartment with the leak in the bathroom ceiling. My life, small, exhausting, unremarkable, suddenly exposed to something monstrous. Morty turned to look at me. Our eyes met in the dim light, and I saw the war happening behind his face. He was calculating, weighing lives. My life, Santoro's family's lives, the lives of everyone on this train, against information he may or may not have had. I know where Santoro is, Morty said. My breath caught. But I'll give you the information under one condition. The girl walks off this train untouched and unremembered. No photographs, no surveillance, no contact. You delete whatever image you have of her. She goes home and this night never happened for her. Swear it on your children, Domenico. Domenico studied Morty's face for a long moment. Then he looked at me, really looked at me, with those cement-colored eyes. Whatever he saw apparently satisfied him, because he nodded. On my children, he said. The girl is nobody. The words should have stung, but they were the most beautiful words I'd ever heard. Morty reached into his coat and produced a small folded paper. He'd had it on him the entire time. He held it out toward Domenico but didn't release it. If anything happens to Santoro's family, or to her, Morty said, the The copies I've made of those ledgers go to every prosecutor in Milan, every journalist at Corriere della Sera, every contact I have in the Guardia di Finanza. Do you understand? Domenico's face hardened, but he took the paper. He unfolded it, read it, and nodded once. Then he looked up at Morty with an expression that was almost respectful. You were always the smarter one, Luca, he said. Enzo should have made you a partner instead of an enemy. Enzo should have left my sister alive. Domenico slipped the paper into his pocket, turned, and walked back toward the front of the carriage. His men followed. The connecting door closed behind them. And Luca Morty, who had just traded a man's location to save a stranger's life, my life, sat down beside me and closed his eyes. His hands were trembling. The train started moving again 12 minutes later. I know because I counted every second. The engine hummed back to life with a shudder, the wheels found their rhythm, and the countryside began sliding past the windows again. Dark fields, distant lights, the silhouette of trees against a sky that was just beginning to hint at the gray of early dawn. The passengers in the carriage slowly uncurled from their protective positions. The woman across the aisle lifted her child back onto the seat. The old man stopped praying. Conversations began in whispers and gradually grew to something approaching normal volume, though nothing about this night was normal and everyone knew it. I sat beside Luca Morty in silence for a long time. His eyes were still closed, but he wasn't sleeping. His breathing was too deliberate, his stillness too conscious. He was somewhere far inside himself, in a place I couldn't follow. You gave them Santoro's location, I finally said. He opened his eyes. Yes. You said you saved his life 6 months ago, and now you just... Santoro knew what he was doing when he ran. He knew the risk. He chose to take the ledgers and disappear because he thought he could use them as leverage. That was his choice. Morty paused. The paper I gave Domenico contains an address in Zurich. By the time Valent's men get there, Santoro will be gone. I sent word 3 days ago for him to move. I stared at him. You planned this. I planned for the possibility. Valent was always going to come for me. It was a question of when, not if. He turned to look out the window. The address will lead them to an empty apartment. It will buy Santoro a few weeks, maybe longer if he's smart about where he goes next. And when Valent finds out the address was a dead end, then we'll have a different kind of conversation, but not on a train full of people. Not with... He glanced at me and stopped himself. Not with someone like me nearby, I finished. He didn't deny it. You were never supposed to be part of this. I sat in that seat because my men had cleared the carriage. Every other passenger was screened. They were strangers, but they were accounted for. The seat beside me was left empty on purpose. A muscle in his jaw worked. And then you walked in, sat down, and asked if the seat was taken. I was tired, I said. It sounded absurd, even to me. I was tired, as if that explained anything, as if that was a reason to sit beside a mafia boss. I know, he said, and the way he said it, with something that sounded almost like tenderness, made my throat tighten. The train began to slow for a station. Genova was still 30 minutes away, but this was one of the smaller stops along the coast. Through the window, I could see a tiny platform lit by a single lamp, a bench, a shuttered ticket window. Nobody was waiting. Morty stood. This is where I get off. I looked up at him. In the returning fluorescent light, the emergency glow fading, he looked different than he had when I first sat down. Not less powerful, not less dangerous, but more human. The lines around his eyes told stories I would never hear. The gray at his temples spoke of years carrying a weight that would have crushed most people. Will they really leave me alone? I asked. Valent's people. Morty reached into his coat and produced a card. Plain white. No name, just a phone number handwritten in blue ink. If anyone contacts you, if you notice anything, anyone watching your apartment, anyone asking about you at work, a car you see too many times, call this number, day or night. I took the card. It was warm from being against his chest. Marco will stay on the train until Genova to make sure you arrive safely, he continued. He'll walk you to a taxi. After tonight, you won't see him again. The train stopped. The doors opened with a hiss of compressed air. The small platform was empty and cold, and the night wind swept through the carriage, carrying the smell of salt from the coast. Morty stepped into the aisle. Before he moved toward the door, he paused and looked back at me one more time. Alina, he said, the seat next to me was empty because everyone on this train knew what I am. They knew the danger. They chose to stay away. He was quiet for a beat. You didn't know, and even after you found out, you chose to stay. I told you, I was safer near you than alone. No, he said, you weren't, but you stayed anyway. He turned and walked toward the door. His bodyguards materialized from different parts of the carriage, 3 men rising from their seats and converging on him with practiced precision. They stepped off the train together, onto the empty platform, and disappeared into the darkness beyond the single lamp. The doors closed, the train moved. I sat there holding the white card, turning it over in my fingers. The woman across the aisle was watching me with an expression I couldn't read, somewhere between pity and awe. "You're lucky to be alive," she whispered. I looked out the window. The platform was already gone, swallowed by the darkness, and the train was picking up speed along the coast. Somewhere out there, Luca Morty was walking through the night with his ghosts, his dead sister, the man he'd tried to save, the empire he carried on his shoulders. I thought about what he'd said, that everyone knew what he was, that they chose to stay away. And I thought about the way he'd looked at me when I refused to leave, like he was seeing something he'd forgotten existed. Trust, maybe. Or just plain, stubborn human decency from someone who didn't know enough to be afraid. The train arrived in Geneva at 1:47 in the morning. True to Morty's word, Marco was waiting by the exit. He walked me to a taxi without speaking a single word, opened the door, and stood on the curb until the car pulled away. I went home. I locked my door. I sat on my bed in my work clothes, still smelling like coffee and kitchen grease, and I stared at the white card until the numbers blurred. 3 weeks later, I was walking home from work when I noticed a black car parked across the street from my apartment building. It had been there the day before, too. Different spot, same car. I went inside, sat on my bed, and dialed the number on the card. It rang twice. "Elena," Morty's voice, calm, immediate, like he'd been waiting. "There's a car," I said, "black outside my building." A pause, then, "It's mine." I blinked. "What?" "I've had someone watching your building since the night on the train, making sure Valent kept his word." Another pause. "He has, but I'm not a man who trusts promises." I leaned back against the wall and let out a breath that shook more than I wanted it to. "You could have told me," I said. "You would have told me to stop." He was right, I would have. The line was quiet for a moment. Outside my window, the city hummed with its ordinary sounds, traffic, voices, a distant siren. The sounds of a life that had almost been taken from me on a late-night train. "Thank you," I said. The words felt small, inadequate, like trying to hold the ocean in cupped hands. "Get some sleep, Elena," he said. "You've had a long day." The line went dead. I put the phone down, turned off the light, and lay in the dark listening to the city breathe. And I thought about that empty seat on a crowded train, the one everyone was too afraid to take. The one I sat down in because my feet hurt and I was tired, and I had no idea what I was walking into. Sometimes the most dangerous seat in the room is the one that changes your life. And sometimes the most dangerous man in the room is the one who makes sure you survive the night. I still have the card. I've never had to call it again. But some nights, when I'm on a late train and there's an empty seat beside a stranger, I remember the weight of that silence, the crack of that gunshot, and the way Luca Morty said my name like it was something worth protecting. And I choose the seat anyway. I don't usually talk about this, but I want to be honest with you. I'm putting a lot of time and effort into these stories, but right now I'm not really earning from them. If you enjoy what I create and decide to join my Patreon, you wouldn't just be getting exclusive content, you'd be helping me continue this journey. It would honestly mean a lot to me. I posted this story on my Patreon. If the thumbnail catches your interest and you want to know what happens next, feel free to check it out on Patreon. I'm putting a lot of time and effort into these stories, and honestly, I'm not earning much from them right now. If you enjoy my content and decide to join, your support would genuinely help me continue creating more stories. It would mean a lot to me.